Millionaire sees a homeless woman with twins, then notices her ring and recognizes his first love. On a frigid night, as the city still buzzed, a millionaire sat in his luxury car at a red light. His eyes idly scanned the sidewalk, then abruptly stopped. A woman sat huddled, holding two children close. She looked utterly spent, yet something about her held his gaze. As the streetlight glinted off her hand, he saw a familiar silver ring, a ring he never thought he'd see again. What had happened to the woman who was once his first love? Before we delve into this story, comment with your city's name and don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming tales every day. The story begins. A young mother sat on the cold pavement, her arms wrapped tightly around her sleeping twin daughters. Her clothes were tattered, her body exhausted, yet her eyes remained resilient. Over the years, Ava Carter had battled the harsh burdens of street life, doing everything to protect Isabella and Chloe. She once had dreams, but now survival was all that mattered. On this fateful night, however, a moment would change everything. A man in a sleek car paused at a red light, glancing out the window. His gaze landed on the woman and the children huddled beside her. Something about her struck him as strangely familiar. Then the light caught the silver ring on her hand, the very ring he had given to the one he never thought he'd see again. What would you do if your past suddenly resurfaced? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more powerful stories that prove life can change in an instant. The night's icy air enveloped Ava Carter like an unwelcome guest, seeping through the holes in her worn coat and biting into her skin. She sat against the rough brick wall of an alleyway, cradling her daughters Isabella and Chloe under their single blanket. The thin fabric offered little protection from the harsh winter chill, but it was all she had. The streets had been their home for too long, and while her body had adapted to the hunger, the exhaustion, the relentless struggle, her heart never did. She looked down at her daughters, their small faces peaceful despite the harsh world they had been born into. They deserved so much more. Chloe stirred first, her tiny fingers curling into Ava's sleeve as she opened her sleepy eyes. "Mommy?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Mommy, why is it always so cold?" Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried a weight that pressed on Ava's heart. Ava forced a smile, brushing Chloe's tangled blonde curls from her face. "Because it's winter, sweetheart," she said, keeping her voice warm despite the ache in her chest. "But you know what cold nights mean? We get to hold each other tighter, and that's the best." Isabella, still half asleep, tightened her arms around Ava's waist. "I don't like the cold," she mumbled. "I want to go home." Ava's breath hitched. Home, a word that once carried warmth, comfort, a sense of belonging. Now it was a distant dream. She swallowed her tears, keeping her voice steady. "We have each other, sweetheart. That's what makes wherever we are home." Chloe looked up, her blue eyes filled with innocence. "Do you think we'll have a real home again? Like the ones with big windows and warm beds?" Ava paused, before pressing a kiss to Chloe's forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, someday we will." She didn't know how, she didn't know when, but she had to believe it for her children. She tightened her arms around them, shielding them as much as she could. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. She had given her children the last of the food she had managed to get earlier, half a stale loaf of bread from a kind stranger who had stopped just long enough to place it on the sidewalk beside her. The world continued to move around them, oblivious, unaware of their struggle. Isabella shifted in her arms, her small hand rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Mommy?" "Yes, sweetheart. Why do people walk past us like they don't see us?" Ava felt her throat tighten. How could she explain to a child that the world often chose to look away from things that made them uncomfortable? That people preferred to pretend suffering didn't exist rather than acknowledge it? "They're busy," she said finally, trying to keep her voice light. "Sometimes people don't stop because they're in a hurry to get to work or back to their families." "But we're people too," Chloe said, frowning. Ava smiled, running her fingers through her daughter's hair. "Yes, sweetheart. And the right people, the ones with kind hearts, they'll see us. They'll help us when we need it most." Isabella rested her head on Ava's shoulder, sighing softly. I just wish Daddy was here. Ava's heart clenched, but she kept her face calm. I know, sweetheart. Does Daddy ever think about us? Chloe asked, her voice so innocent, so filled with hope. It almost made Ava break down. She hesitated, then kissed the top of Chloe's head. I don't know, sweetheart, but what I do know is that you have me, and I'll never leave you. The children didn't speak after that. Perhaps they understood the truth Ava could never voice. Their father had left before they were born, vanished without a word. They were nothing more than a mistake in his eyes. Ava shifted, adjusting the blanket around her daughters as the wind picked up. Her fingers unconsciously toyed with the silver ring on her hand, a relic of a past that felt like another lifetime. It had once symbolized love, promises, a future that never materialized. Now, it was just a cold piece of metal against her skin, a reminder of what she had lost. A strong gust of wind swept through the alley, making Chloe shiver. Ava quickly pulled her daughters closer. Close your eyes, my loves. I'll keep you warm. Chloe buried her face into Ava's side, while Isabella clung tightly to her. Mommy? Yes, sweetheart. Will things ever get better? Ava closed her eyes, pressing a long kiss to Isabella's forehead. Yes, sweetheart, they will. I promise. She didn't know how she would keep that promise, but she had to for her children. The city never truly slept. It throbbed with life, even as the night wore on. Its streets filled with hurried footsteps, distant sirens, and the occasional honk of an impatient driver. But for Ava Carter, it was a world she was no longer a part of. She sat huddled on the cold pavement, her back against the rough brick wall of a building, her arms wrapped tightly around her daughters Isabella and Chloe. The children slept curled together under the tattered, thin blanket she had managed to get from a shelter weeks ago. Their soft, even breaths were the only things that reminded her to keep going. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, exhaustion weighed down her limbs, but she had no choice. Her daughters depended on her. With trembling fingers, she held out a small paper cup, its rim crumpled and weak, a silent plea for kindness. But people walked past as if she didn't exist, their eyes avoiding hers as if acknowledging her would somehow taint them. She wasn't just homeless. She was invisible. Occasionally, a passerby would glance her way, some with pity, others with disgust, a few muttering under their breath, their voices dripping with judgment. She probably brought this on herself. A man whispered to his wife as they passed in their pristine winter coats. People like her just don't try hard enough. Ava clenched her jaw, swallowing the anger and humiliation that rose in her throat. If only they knew, if only they understood that she hadn't chosen this life, that a cruel twist of fate had thrust her into a world of survival she never imagined. She wanted to scream at them, to make them see her, but she had learned long ago that society preferred its illusions. It was easier for them to believe she was a product of her own failures than to accept that sometimes life simply didn't give everyone a fair chance. The night grew colder, and Ava shivered despite her attempts to stay warm. Her coat, once thick and comforting, had lost its ability to shield her from the biting air. Her hands ached with cold, her fingertips numb as she leaned down to gently adjust the blanket over Isabella's small shoulders. Her daughters deserved warmth, food, a bed, not the unforgiving pavement of a city that refused to acknowledge them. She wished she could get them into a shelter, but space was always limited, and she had been turned away too many times. Families weren't always a priority when beds were scarce. She had fought for spots before, standing in endless lines, only to be told at the last minute that there was no room. The disappointment in her daughter's eyes each time broke her a little more. She hated that they were growing up thinking this was normal, that they were learning to adapt to a life no child should know. A woman in a designer coat walked past her, her high heels clicking on the pavement. She was older, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her posture rigid as she caught Ava's eye. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Ava didn't dare speak, but she tilted the cup slightly, a silent request. The woman's face hardened, and without a word, she clutched her expensive leather purse to her side, as if afraid Ava would lunge for it. The insult stung more than Ava cared to admit. Did she really look that desperate, that dangerous? She wasn't a thief. She was a mother trying to keep her children alive. The woman quickened her pace, her disgust evident in every movement, as if Ava's very existence offended her. Ava released a slow, shaky breath, lowering the cup to her lap. It wasn't the first time someone had reacted like that, and it wouldn't be the last. She leaned her head back against the wall, taking deep breaths, trying to push back the bitterness. It wouldn't help her. It wouldn't feed her daughters. She needed to focus. A few coins rattled at the bottom of the cup, not even enough for a proper meal. Maybe if she found a diner with a kind employee, they would let her buy something small, a piece of bread, perhaps something to stave off the hunger, at least for a little while. She looked down at her daughters, their faces peaceful despite the cold. She envied their ability to sleep soundly, oblivious to how she was failing them. A lump rose in her throat. She couldn't cry, not here, not now. A man in a dark coat walked past, then stopped a few steps away. Ava barely noticed at first, too lost in her own thoughts. But when he turned back and approached her, she instinctively pulled her children closer. Not everyone who stopped had good intentions, but the man didn't seem threatening. His expression was unreadable, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out a $5 bill, carefully placing it into her cup. Ava's eyes widened slightly. $5 could buy a warm drink, a sandwich, something more than just scraps. She looked up at him, her lips parting slightly as if to say something, but he was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd. She swallowed, clutching the bill in her frozen fingers. She had learned not to expect kindness, and when it came, it always caught her off guard. She turned to her daughters, running her fingers over Isabella's cheek. "Wake up, my loves," she whispered gently. Isabella stirred, blinking sleepily. "We're going to find some food." Chloe yawned, rubbing her eyes as she sat up. "Did someone help us, Mommy?" Ava hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, someone did." Chloe smiled, resting her head against Ava's arm. "See, I told you there were good people." Ava's chest tightened. Chloe still believed in goodness, in kindness. She still believed the world was fair. Ava wanted to protect that innocence for as long as possible. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. "You're right," as she carefully lifted the blanket off them. Tucking it into her bag, she forced herself to stand, ignoring the ache in her legs from sitting on the hard pavement. She took Isabella's hand in one of her own and Chloe's in the other, holding them tightly as they stepped out of the alleyway shelter. The streets were still full of people who would look right through them, but she clung to the hope that somewhere among them, someone would see them, someone would care, and perhaps, just perhaps, tomorrow wouldn't be as cold. The night dragged on. The city bathed in the artificial glow of streetlights illuminating the damp sidewalks. Liam Montgomery sat in the back of his sleek black sedan, his fingers tapping an unconscious rhythm on his knee as he stared at the line of cars ahead. The traffic was infuriating, an endless sea of brake lights stretching down the road, each car inching forward. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. Another late night, another long meeting had drained the last of his patience. He loosened his tie slightly, glancing at his driver, who sat motionless, gripping the steering wheel with the silent resignation of a man accustomed to long waits. The honking of horns, the distant wail of sirens, and the occasional shouts of impatient drivers all blended into the city's chaotic symphony. He sighed and shifted his gaze to the sidewalk, scanning the blurred faces of pedestrians hurrying past, eager to escape the cold, and then his breath caught in his throat. At first, he thought it was just another face in the crowd, just another mother struggling to survive the harsh reality of the streets. But something about her made him freeze. A woman sat huddled against a building, her arms wrapped tightly around two sleeping children. Her coat was too thin for the cold, her hair disheveled, strands falling across her face as she pressed her lips to the forehead of one of the children. The way she held them, the way she shielded them from the biting wind made something twist painfully in his chest. But it wasn't just the heartbreaking sight that unsettled him. It was the vague sense of familiarity. the nagging feeling that he knew her. He frowned, leaning forward slightly, trying to make out her features through the tinted window. She lifted her head for a brief moment, her eyes scanning the street as if searching for something, someone, and then he saw it, the silver ring on her finger. His pulse quickened as his mind raced to catch up with what his eyes had just registered. He knew that ring, he had seen it before, held it in his own hands. The light from a nearby streetlight reflected off its simple yet unmistakable design, and memories flooded his mind like an unstoppable torrent. He hadn't seen that ring in years, not since he had slipped it onto the slender finger of the only woman he had ever truly loved. His heart pounded in his chest, disbelief warring with recognition. Impossible, could it be? His hand hovered over the door handle, his instincts screaming at him to get out of the car, to go to her, to find out if his mind was playing tricks on him. But he hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if this was just a cruel coincidence? A cruel coincidence. And yet, the way she moved, the way she clutched her daughters to her chest as if shielding them from the world, it was all too familiar. He tightened his grip on the door handle, and before he could think better of it, he pushed the door open and stepped out. The sudden movement startled Ava. She had been too focused on Isabella's restless shifting in her arms, too consumed by the ache of her own exhaustion to notice the sleek black car idling just a few feet away. But when the door opened and the tall figure of a man emerged, her body tensed. Years of living on the streets had made her wary, cautious of sudden movements, of men approaching too quickly. She instinctively pulled her daughters closer, her heart pounding with familiar fear. She looked up, ready to move, to run if necessary. But then she saw him. For one long moment, they just stared at each other. Liam approached hesitantly, his breath visible in the cold air, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the girl he once knew. Her face was thinner now, her cheeks hollow, her eyes dulled with exhaustion. But it was her, Emily. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath for a moment. How had this happened? How had she fallen so far? Ava's eyes flickered with confusion, recognition dawning at the edge of her weary mind. There was something familiar about him, but her exhaustion made it hard to place. Then her gaze landed on his face, the sharpness of his features, the piercing blue eyes she once knew so well. A shiver ran down her spine, and she felt her throat tighten. No, it can't be. It can't be. Emily? Liam's voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed across the distance between them like thunder. Ava froze, instinctively tightening her arms around her daughters. Her mind screamed at her to move, to turn away, but her body was rooted to the spot. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She didn't know what to say. She didn't even know how to breathe. Liam took another cautious step, as if afraid she would disappear if he moved too quickly. "It's you," he said, his voice laced with something she couldn't quite place, perhaps shock, even pain. How could this have happened? Ava's pulse roared in her ears. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her life was built on survival, on keeping her daughters safe, but in this moment, with Liam standing before her, she felt like the 17-year-old girl she used to be, the girl who had believed in love, in forever, the girl who had been abandoned. Isabella shifted in her arms, and Chloe whimpered softly, her small hands clutching Ava's coat. The movement brought Ava back to reality. It didn't matter who he was. It didn't matter that seeing him made old wounds ache in ways she thought she had long buried. She was a mother, her daughters came first, always. She swallowed, forcing herself to be hard. I need to go. Liam's face changed, confusion etching his features. "Wait, Emily, please." But she had already turned away, had already pulled Isabella and Chloe closer, had already retreated into the shadows, because no matter how much her heart recognized him, she was no longer that girl, and the life he lived now was not for someone like her. Liam Montgomery stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared at the woman before him. The moment he had seen the silver ring glinting in the dim streetlight, something inside him had shattered, a flood of memories surging back like a tempest. That ring, it wasn't just any ring, it had belonged to his mother, a piece of her he had cherished for years before giving it to the only person he believed would always be a part of his life. His fingers clenched at his sides as the reality of the situation crashed down on him. This woman, the one holding two fragile children in her arms, her body curled into a protective shield, was Emily, his Ava, or at least she had been. But the girl he had loved was gone, replaced by a woman with hollow cheeks, eyes sunken with exhaustion, her clothes barely enough to ward off the biting night air. His breath hitched as the weight of what he was seeing pressed down on him. What had happened to her? How had she fallen so far? Emily, oblivious to his inner turmoil, held her daughters closer, her fingers instinctively tightening around Chloe's small shoulders. The sudden attention from the man standing before her made her uneasy. She had learned long ago that prolonged eye contact with strangers rarely led to anything good. She kept her gaze low, avoiding confrontation, focusing instead on shielding her children from the biting wind. But then she noticed something strange, the way the man was looking at her, as if he knew her, as if he was trying to pull a memory from a distant past. Her pulse quickened, her body tensing with apprehension. She didn't know him, at least she didn't think she did, but there was something disturbingly familiar about his sharp blue eyes, the way his facial features twisted with something she couldn't name. She swallowed, dismissing the thought. It didn't matter, no one from her past ever came back for her, why would that change now? Liam stepped forward, barely aware of his own movement. He needed confirmation, needed to hear her voice, needed to know for certain that his mind wasn't playing cruel tricks. Emily? His voice was strained, almost hoarse, as if calling her name caused the air in his lungs to collapse. The sound startled her slightly, but she didn't react. He tried again, this time a little surer. Ava Carter? Then he saw it, the slight widening of her eyes, the flicker of recognition buried beneath layers of weariness and time. But she didn't acknowledge it, instead pulling her daughters closer, her arms forming a protective barrier. She didn't recognize him, or perhaps she refused to. Ava's breath came in shallow, rapid gasps, her mind reeling for answers. Why did he know her name, and why did the way he said it cause something inside her to ache in a way she hadn't felt in years? Her fingers instinctively traced the ring on her hand, the only thing she had left from a life long gone. It had once been a symbol of love, of security, now it was just another relic of a past she could never return to. She forced herself to meet his eyes, determined to keep her voice steady. I don't know you, she said, her tone firm despite the tremor in her hands. Please, just leave us alone. Liam felt those words like a slap, but he knew better than to retreat. He couldn't, not now. He took another cautious step, not wanting to frighten her, but unable to let her disappear back into the city's shadows. Emily, it's me, he insisted, searching her face for something, anything that showed she still remembered. Ethan. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with 1,000 unspoken things. He watched her closely, waiting for the flicker of recognition, waiting for the past to come flooding back, as it had for him. But Ava's expression remained guarded, her lips pressed into a thin line as she shook her head. I don't know you, she repeated, her voice smaller, less certain this time. But she did know. She knew that name. It had once meant everything to her. It had been whispered in stolen moments, laughed in late-night conversations, cried in the silence of heartbreak. And yet standing here now, looking at the man before her, the man she had once loved with everything she had, she felt as if he belonged to a completely different life. A life that had been ripped away from her the moment she was thrown into the world with nothing but a broken heart and a child growing inside her. Liam exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair in frustration. This wasn't how this moment was supposed to go. He had imagined seeing her again in entirely different circumstances, if he had even dared to imagine it at all. But never like this, never with her looking at him as if he were a stranger. His gaze flickered to the children in her arms, their small faces buried against her chest. His stomach clenched. They were hers, that was clear, but where was their father? What had happened to her after she left? He had 1,000 questions, but none more pressing than the one that weighed on his chest. Emily, what happened to you? His voice was softer now, almost pleading. Ava gave a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. Life happened, she said simply, shifting her daughters in her arms. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to take care of my children. She turned to walk away, ready to disappear before the past could sink its claws into her and unravel the fragile world she had built around herself. But Liam wasn't willing to let her go, not this time, not without understanding how the girl he had loved had become the woman standing before him now, shrouded in struggle and silence. He had lost her once, he wasn't about to lose her again. Liam stood in the cold night air, his breath visible as he watched Ava clutch her daughters close, her body tense like a cornered animal. The weight of all the unspoken things between them filled the space, heavy with hesitation and old wounds. He had just found her, yet she looked at him as if he were an intruder in her fragile world. He wanted to reach out to tell her he hadn't forgotten, that he had never stopped thinking about her, but he knew better. Ava Carter was no longer the girl he had held on warm summer nights. Life had changed her, hardened her, and yet, despite the exhaustion etched on her features, despite the way she shielded her daughters from him, she was still Ava, the girl he had loved, the girl he had lost. "I want to help you," Liam said, his voice steady, cautious. He knew if he pushed too hard, she would run. He could see it in the way her fingers tightened on her daughters' coats, her body instinctively preparing to flee. "I know you don't believe me, but please, let me help." Ava exhaled, her breath trembling as she looked down at Isabella and Chloe. Their small faces turned towards her, their innocent eyes reflecting only trust. She had spent years surviving, scraping by, doing everything she could to protect them. Accepting help, especially from him, felt like failure, like admitting she wasn't strong enough on her own. But did she have a choice? The cold was relentless and the weariness in her daughter's eyes was becoming harder to ignore. She looked back at Ethan, her jaw clenched. "Why?" Her voice was sharp, laced with suspicion. "Why do you want to help me now?" Liam flinched slightly at the bitterness in her voice, but he didn't back down. "Because I should have found you sooner," he admitted, the guilt in his voice echoing. "Because whatever happened between us, it doesn't change the fact that you don't deserve this, and neither do they." He nodded towards the children. "You don't have to struggle like this anymore." Ava gave a humorless laugh, shaking her head. "You think it's that simple?" she asked, tightening her arms around her daughters. "That I just get in your car and everything magically gets better?" She took a step back, instinctively recoiling from the thought. "The world doesn't work like that, Ethan. You don't know what it's like out here. You don't understand what it means to be abandoned, to have to fight for every scrap." She cut herself off, her lips pressed together as she struggled to control the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Liam's expression darkened. "You think I don't understand regret?" he asked softly, his voice steady but firm. "You think I don't know what it's like to carry the weight of guilt for years, wondering what could have been different?" He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "I don't know everything you've been through, Emily, but I know I failed you and I'm trying to make it right." Ava swallowed, looking away. Part of her wanted to believe him, part of her wanted to step into the warmth of his world, to allow herself to rest for the first time in years. But another part, the part that had learned how to survive, the part that had built walls around her heart, screamed at her to turn away, to protect herself before it was too late. People didn't offer help without expecting something in return. That was a lesson life had taught her time and time again. A gentle tug on her sleeve stopped her. She looked down to see Chloe looking up at her, her small fingers clutching Ava's coat. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so cold." That was it. That was the moment Ava felt herself break. Whatever pride she had, whatever fears she held, none of it mattered in the face of her daughter's suffering. She had spent so long running, so long trying to protect them, but was she really protecting them, or was she letting her own stubbornness keep them from a chance at something better? Her throat tightened as she looked back at Ethan, her eyes holding something he had never seen before, defeat, but also a desperate hope. "If I do this," she whispered, her voice trembling, "it's not for me, it's for them." Liam nodded, understanding. "I wouldn't expect anything less." For the first time in years, Ava allowed herself to be weak, allowed herself to trust, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, things could change. With slow, hesitant steps, she took Isabella's hand, then Chloe's, pulling them closer as she turned towards Ethan's sleek black car. Each step was heavy, as if she was walking towards something irreversible, and perhaps she was. As they approached the car, she hesitated. The polished surface reflected a distorted image of herself, a woman who had spent too long in the shadows, who barely recognized the girl she used to be. Her fingers hovered over the door handle, doubt gnawing at her one last time. But then she felt a tiny squeeze on her hand, Chloe, a silent reminder that this wasn't about pride, it was about survival. Taking a deep breath, Ava opened the door. The warmth from inside enveloped her immediately, foreign and unfamiliar. She settled the children in first, ensuring they were safe, ensuring this wasn't a dream. Finally, she climbed into the seat. The cushion beneath her was soft, comforting, making her want to cry. She didn't belong here, and yet here she was. Liam watched her carefully, sensing the battle raging inside her. He didn't rush her, didn't speak right away, he simply closed the door behind her and walked around to the driver's side. As the car pulled away from the curb, Ava looked out the window, watching the streets she had called home disappear behind her. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure where she was going, and for the first time in years, she dared to hope. The drive to Liam's mansion was silent, heavy with unspoken fears and uncertainties. Ava sat stiffly in the back seat, her fingers unconsciously clutching the fabric of her worn coat. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to run back to the familiarity of the streets before she stepped too far into a world she didn't belong in. But then she glanced at Isabella and Chloe curled up together, their bodies finally warm after nights of shivering. They looked peaceful for the first time in a long time. That was the only reason she didn't beg Liam to turn the car around. Not for her, but for them. She had to keep reminding herself of that. As the car slowed, she turned her gaze to the window and her breath hitched. The mansion before her was vast, towering like something out of a dream she had no right to be in. Pristine white stone, a massive arched entryway, perfectly manicured hedges, it was the kind of house she had only ever seen in magazines, a stark contrast to the grimy alleyways and shelters she had known for the past 8 years. Everything about it exuded wealth, luxury, exclusivity. She felt like an intruder just looking at it. Her fingers tightened on the seatbelt as the car rolled through the towering iron gates, and her heart pounded with an inexplicable dread. She didn't belong here, and she was certain whoever was inside would make sure she knew it. As soon as the car stopped in the circular driveway, the front door opened and an older man stepped out. Even in the dim evening light, Ava could see the authority in his posture, the sharpness in his eyes. His presence commanded attention. Richard Montgomery, Ethan's father, a man who had built an empire from nothing, a ruthless businessman known for his cold efficiency and an even colder heart. He had aged since she last saw him, his hair now completely white, his once youthful features hardened by time, but his expression was just as she remembered, stern, unforgiving, and at this moment, aimed directly at her. Liam barely had time to step out of the car before Richard spoke, his voice sharp as steel. "What is the meaning of this, Liam? What in God's name is this?" His eyes flickered to Emily, then to the sleeping children in the back seat. He frowned deeper, his hands clenching at his sides. "Who are they, Ethan, and why are they in my driveway?" Liam squared his shoulders, his jaw clenched. "They're my guests," he said firmly, stepping aside to allow Ava and the children to exit the car. Ava hesitated for a fraction of a second before carefully unbuckling her daughters and lifting them into her arms. Isabella stirred slightly but remained asleep, her small fingers clutching Ava's coat. She held them tightly as if bracing for impact. Richard's expression darkened as his eyes swept over them. "Guests?" he repeated, his tone laced with undisguised contempt. "Ethan, have you lost your mind? You've brought a homeless woman and 2 children to her home." Ava flinched at the words, shame burning through her, but she held her head high. She had been called worse. Still, hearing those words from someone like Richard Montgomery, someone who had once been a part of the life she had lost, stung in a way she hadn't expected. She forced herself to meet his eyes, even as she felt the weight of his judgment pressing down on her. Liam stepped closer to his father, his expression unwavering. "Yes, I have, and they'll be staying." Richard gave a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This isn't a charity, Ethan. This is our home, we don't take in strays." Ava's fingers curled into fists at the word strays, as if she and her daughters were nothing more than abandoned animals seeking shelter where they didn't belong. Every part of her wanted to turn and walk away before he could say something worse, but then she felt Chloe shift in her arms, sighing softly in her sleep, and she forced herself to stand her ground. She wasn't here for herself, she was here for her children. Liam's eyes flashed with frustration. "They have nowhere else to go," he said through gritted teeth, "and I won't have them sleeping on the streets while I have the means to help." Richard scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "So, you think bringing them here solves everything? Do you have any idea what kind of attention this will draw? The media, the investors, what will they say when they find out the heir to Montgomery Enterprises is harboring a homeless woman?" Liam didn't hesitate. "I don't care what they say." Richard's nostrils flared, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Of course, you don't. You never think of the consequences, Ethan. You never think of how your actions affect this family." His voice lowered, growing sharper. "That woman doesn't belong in our world." Silence hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Ava clenched her jaw, refusing to let the words sink in any deeper than they already had. She had heard similar words before, from her own family, from the people who had turned their backs on her when she needed them most. She had learned long ago that people like Richard Montgomery would never see her as anything more than an inconvenience. Liam exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling as he fought to control his anger. Finally, he spoke. "You're wrong," his voice was quieter, but there was no mistaking the steel in it. "She belongs wherever I say she does." Richard's eyes flashed with something unreadable, but he said nothing. The tension between father and son was palpable, stretched between them like a thin wire ready to snap. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Richard released a sharp breath and turned on his heel. "Do as you please," he said coldly, "but don't expect me to clean up your mess when it all falls apart." With that, he disappeared into the house, leaving only the echo of his disapproval behind. Ava stood motionless, her daughters still cradled in her arms, her heart pounding in her chest. She should have felt relief that the confrontation was over, but instead all she felt was exhaustion. This was just the beginning, and she knew it. No matter how much Liam wanted to help, no matter how much he believed in her, the world he belonged to would never accept someone like her. Liam turned to her, his expression softer now. "Let's go," he said gently. "I'll take you and the kids inside." Ava hesitated, glancing towards the grand entrance of the mansion. The warmth, the safety, it was right there, but so was the overwhelming sense that she didn't belong. Yet, when she looked at her sleeping daughters in her arms, she knew she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. The warm light of the mansion's living room enveloped her, suffocating her. The soft mattress under Ava's tired body, the soft fleece blanket draped over her shoulders, things that had been dreams now felt foreign, as if she were playing a role in someone else's life. Isabella and Chloe were curled up beside her, their small bodies breathing in perfect rhythm, their faces relaxed for the first time in days. She should have felt relief, she should have felt safe, but the weight of the past pressed down on her chest, refusing to let her rest. The confrontation with Richard, the tension in Liam's voice as he stood up for her, it had cracked something inside her, something she had spent years burying. She turned onto her side, staring up at the ceiling, memories creeping in like shadows in the night. She had once believed in fairy tales, not the kind with castles and crowns, but the kind where love was enough, where two people could hold hands and build a future out of nothing but a promise. She had been 17, reckless and hopeful, when she fell in love with Liam Montgomery. He was her world, her safe haven, the only one who looked at her and saw more than a girl trying to escape the expectations of a strict, unyielding family. She had loved him with everything she had, clung to him as if he were the only light in the darkness, and for a while he had loved her too, or at least she had believed he did. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to stem the bitter tide of tears. Her parents had never approved of Ethan. The Montgomerys were powerful, wealthy, untouchable, and they had always reminded her that girls like her, ordinary, plain, didn't belong in his world. But she didn't care. She had spent stolen nights in his arms, whispering dreams of the future, laughing at the absurdity of fate that had brought them together. They had talked about leaving, about running away and starting over somewhere far away, away from the expectations that weighed down on them both. And then she had found out she was pregnant. She could still hear her mother's voice the night she confessed the truth, the anger, the disgust, the way her father had stood there, arms crossed, unmoving as her mother's words cut into her like knives. "You've ruined yourself, Emily. You think he'll stay? You think a Montgomery would ever claim a girl like you?" The shame had been unbearable, but she had refused to believe them. Liam wasn't like that. He had promised her a future, he had promised her love. But when she had gone to him, scared and vulnerable, clutching the pregnancy test in her trembling hand, everything had changed. At first, he had been silent, just standing there looking at her, his expression unreadable. She had waited, her heart pounding, needing him to say something, anything to reassure her that they would figure it out together. But then he had run a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Emily, I don't know if I can do this." Those words had hit her harder than any slap, stealing her breath. She had begged him to talk to her, to tell her they could make it work, that he wouldn't turn his back on her, but he had just shaken his head, panic in his eyes. She had left that night, feeling empty, feeling like the world had cracked beneath her feet. And when she had returned home, her parents had been waiting. No sympathy, no comfort, just their final judgment. Her mother had packed a bag for her, leaving it by the front door as her father's cold voice echoed in her ears. "If you walk out that door, don't come back." She had begged them to reconsider, to show even a sliver of kindness, but they had turned their backs on her. She had been 17, pregnant, and utterly alone. The years that followed had been nothing but survival, shelters, hunger, nights curled up in subway stations when there was nowhere else to go. She had learned quickly that the world wasn't kind to girls like her, that kindness was rare and trust was a dangerous thing. She had given birth to Isabella and Chloe with only a stranger's hand to hold, a nurse who looked at her with pity as she brought her daughters into a world that had already rejected them. And in the moment she held them, the moment their tiny hands curled around her finger, she had made a promise. "I will never leave you. I will never be like them." Now, years later, she sat in a house a world away from the one she had known, staring at the man who had once been everything to her. Liam stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. She didn't know how long he had been standing there watching her, but she didn't care. She was too tired to pretend, too exhausted to hide the truth in her eyes. She turned to face him fully, her voice soft but firm. "Why are you doing this, Liam? You were the only good thing in my youth." Liam flinched as if the words had struck him a physical blow. He took a slow step forward, his jaw clenched. "Emily, He paused, hesitating. She saw it, the regret in his eyes, the weight of guilt pressing down on him, but it was too late for apologies, too late for him to rewrite the past. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "Don't," she said, her voice weary, "don't say you're sorry, it won't change anything." Liam sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I should have been there," he admitted. "I should have fought for you." Ava gave a bitter laugh. "You had your chance," she said, her voice hoarse, "but you walked away." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. He wanted to make it right. She could see it in the way he looked at her, the way his hands clenched at his sides as if trying to restrain something, but she was no longer a girl desperate for his love. She had been broken and rebuilt too many times to believe in fairy tales. Liam finally spoke, his voice soft. "I want to help you now." Ava met his eyes, something unreadable flickering in her expression. "Then don't make me regret letting you." With that, she turned back to her daughters, gently stroking Chloe's sleeping face. The past couldn't be undone, but perhaps, just perhaps, the future could be different. The days that followed Ava's arrival at Liam's house were filled with tension, adjustment, and silent battles that none of them dared to acknowledge. Liam had expected Ava to soften under the warmth of stability, to welcome the comfort of a roof over her head, of food that wasn't from discarded scraps, but she remained wary, keeping a safe distance, as if afraid that at any moment the life he had given her would be ripped away. He saw it in the way she moved through the mansion, never quite settling, never allowing herself to get too comfortable. She would sit on the edge of the couch instead of sinking into the cushions. She would hesitate before accepting a warm meal, as if expecting strings to be attached, and at night, he knew she barely slept, always half awake, always ready to leave if she needed to. It frustrated him how deeply conditioned she was to believe that kindness was only temporary, that people only helped when they wanted something in return. But beyond that frustration, there was something else, something deeper, a quiet admiration that grew stronger with every moment he spent watching her. Not her beauty, though she was still breathtakingly beautiful in a way that made his chest ache, but her resilience, the way she carried herself despite everything she had been through. The way she endured, the way she spoke softly to her daughters even when she was exhausted, even when the weight of the world pressed down on her shoulders, the way she still held her head high, refusing to be broken by life's cruelty. Liam had met countless women, polished, graceful women who came from his world and knew how to navigate its rules, but none of them held his attention like Emily. None of them made him feel like this. One evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, Liam found her sitting outside on the balcony, a warm cup of tea in her hands. The mansion's sprawling garden stretched out before her, a world of green and quiet that was foreign to her. She didn't hear him approach, too lost in her thoughts, her fingers unconsciously tracing the rim of the cup. "You look like you're trying to escape," he said softly, leaning against the doorframe. She didn't startle, didn't turn immediately, instead releasing a soft sigh before finally glancing at him. "I'm not used to this," she admitted, her voice almost hesitant. "The quiet, the space?" She gestured vaguely towards the open space, the vastness of the grounds surrounding them. "It feels unnatural." Liam moved closer, pulling up a chair beside her. "You don't have to keep looking over your shoulder, Emily," he said, watching her carefully. "No one's going to take this away from you." She gave a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head. "That's the thing, Ethan. Nothing's permanent, not safety, not kindness. I learned that the hard way." She finally met his eyes, and the raw sincerity in them stole his breath. "People don't help without expecting something in return." Those words stung more than he expected. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that he was different, but was he? He had abandoned her before, he had let her suffer alone, he was just like the people she had learned not to trust. "I don't expect anything from you," he said instead, his voice softer now. "I just want you to know that you don't have to fight so hard anymore." Ava studied him for a moment, searching for lies, hidden motives, but there was nothing in his expression but quiet sincerity, and that scared her more than anything. "I don't know how to be any other way," she admitted. "Fighting is all I've ever done." Silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Liam watched as she took a slow sip of her tea, her fingers tightening around the cup as if grounding herself, and then before he could stop himself, he reached across the table and took her free hand in his. Her body tensed immediately, her first instinct to pull away, but she didn't. She let him hold her hand, let his warmth seep into her skin, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to run. Liam traced the lines of her knuckles, memorizing the feel of her, the slight roughness of her fingertips, evidence of years of survival. He had never stopped loving her. He knew that now, whatever had happened between them years ago, whatever had been torn apart by time and circumstance, it had never truly gone away. He had convinced himself she was just a memory, a painful regret, but sitting here touching her, feeling her presence so close, it was clear she had never just been a memory, she had always been a part of him, buried beneath years of mistakes. Ava swallowed, finally breaking the silence. "This doesn't change anything, Ethan," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "I know," he whispered back, "but it's a start." And for the first time, Ava didn't pull her hand away. The morning was unusually quiet in the Montgomery mansion, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as if the very air was holding its breath. Liam sat at the dining table, sipping his coffee while his mind drifted to Emily. She was settling in, slowly, cautiously, as if she expected everything to fall apart beneath her at any moment. He had seen it in her eyes last night, the silent battle between trust and fear, the way she hesitated before allowing herself to relax, even for a moment. He didn't blame her. Years of surviving on the streets had taught her that nothing good lasted forever, and yet, despite everything, he was determined to show her that this time was different. Thoughts of him were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, approaching footsteps. James, the family's longtime butler, entered the room, his usually calm demeanor slightly off. Something in his posture, the way he clutched a single envelope in his hand, made Liam immediately sit up straighter. Walter placed the letter precisely on the table in front of him. "Sir, this arrived early this morning, no return address." His voice was even, but Liam could sense the undercurrent of unease. He set his coffee aside and picked up the envelope, turning it over in his hands. The paper was thick, expensive, not the kind sent by ordinary people. A sense of foreboding washed over him as he carefully tore open the envelope and pulled out the letter inside. The moment his eyes scanned the lines, his hand clenched around the paper. "Stay away from her, stay away from her children. You have no idea who you're dealing with." No signature, no indication of who had sent it, just those cold words, neatly typed, precise, as if the writer wanted no room for misinterpretation. A slow burn of anger rose in Liam's chest as he reread the message. Someone was watching them, someone knew Ava was here, and worse, they wanted her gone. He exhaled sharply, his jaw clenched as he folded the letter and placed it back on the table. Walter cleared his throat. "Sir, do you believe this is a genuine threat?" Liam didn't hesitate. "Yes." His voice was calm, but his mind was racing. Who would do this? Who had been watching Emily? He thought back to everything she had told him about her life on the streets, about the people she had met, about the father of her children who had abandoned her without a word. Could it be him? Could Jake Parker have resurfaced after all these years? The thought sent a fresh wave of anger through him. If Jake thought he could waltz back into Ava's life and tear her away from safety, he had another thing coming. Walter studied Liam for a moment before speaking again. "Should I inform Mr. Richard of this?" Liam hesitated. His father would use this as an excuse to get rid of Emily, to prove his point that she didn't belong here. Richard already disapproved of her presence. This would only give him more reason to push her away. But this wasn't just about class differences anymore. This was a direct threat, and threats weren't something to ignore. "Not yet," Liam said finally. "I want to handle this myself first." He rose from his chair, letter in hand, and headed towards the hallway. He needed to see Emily, she needed to know what they were dealing with. As he approached the private living area of the house, he slowed, taking a breath before knocking lightly on the door. It opened almost immediately, and Ava stood there, her expression wary. "What is it?" she asked, immediately sensing the tension in his demeanor. Liam held out the letter. "Someone sent this." Ava frowned, taking the paper from his hand. As her eyes scanned the lines, her face paled, her fingers tightening slightly as she gripped the letter. "No," she whispered almost inaudibly. Liam's stomach clenched at her reaction. "Emily," he said carefully. "Do you know who sent this?" She shook her head, but the panic in her eyes betrayed her. "I don't know," she said, but her voice was thin, uncertain. "It could be anyone. I've been looking over my shoulder for years, Ethan. People don't just let you disappear. There are debts, favors, and there's Jake." She swallowed. He never wanted them, but that doesn't mean he wants them safe. Liam's hands curled into fists at his sides. The thought that the father of her children could be involved in this made his blood boil. "If it's him, I'll deal with it," he said firmly. "No one is going to touch you or the kids." Ava released a shaky breath, running a hand through her hair. "You don't understand. People like Jake, men like him, don't just disappear. If he's back, it's because he thinks he has power over me. And if someone else sent this, it means they know where I am. That's never good." Liam stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Then we'll find out who it is. I won't let anyone threaten you." Ava met his eyes, and for the first time he saw real fear there, not just for herself, but for Isabella and Chloe. She had spent years surviving, fighting to keep them safe, and now that she had let her guard down, someone was watching, someone wanted her gone. Liam reached out, gently placing his hand over hers. Ava released a shaky breath, clutching the letter in her free hand, but promises didn't stop threats, and she knew deep down that this was just the beginning. Liam sat in his office, his fingers tapping a rhythm on the polished mahogany desk as he stared at the computer screen. The letter was the first warning, but something deep inside him told him it wouldn't be the last. Whoever had sent it knew where Ava was, and that meant they were being watched. The thought of someone lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, made his stomach clench with unease. He had spent the last 2 hours making calls, trying to connect the dots, trying to figure out who wanted to harm Ava and her daughters. And then he found the answer he had been dreading. Jake Parker was back in town. The moment the name flashed on the screen, Liam's hand tightened on the mouse. A name he hadn't heard in years, a name that carried a trail of destruction wherever it went. Jake Parker, the man who had abandoned Ava when she needed him most, the man who had left her alone, pregnant and helpless, only to disappear like a ghost. Liam had never met him, but he had seen the damage he had caused, and now he was back. Liam leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just a coincidence. Jake's sudden reappearance, the threatening letter, it was all connected. He needed to tell Emily, but how? How did he tell her that the man who had shattered her world once before was lurking just outside her newfound safety? He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. She deserved to know, even if it terrified her. By the time he knocked on Ava's door, it was late, the house quiet except for the soft whisper of the wind outside. She answered quickly, her expression wary, as if she had sensed something was wrong. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice soft, cautious. She had been on edge ever since the letter arrived, and he couldn't blame her. "Can I come in?" His voice was softer than usual, careful. She studied him for a moment before stepping aside. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a night light casting a warm light over Isabella and Chloe's sleeping forms. Ava glanced at them before crossing her arms, her posture defensive. "What is it?" she asked, cutting straight to the chase. Liam hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. "Jake's back." Ava's face paled. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe, then slowly she shook her head, as if denying the words outright. "No," she whispered, "he can't." Liam stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I had someone look into it. He's been back for 3 days. He's been asking about you." Ava's hands trembled as she gripped the back of the chair, holding on for balance. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, the past crashing down on her all at once, overwhelming her. The last time she had seen Jake Parker, he had walked away without a second glance, without caring that she was carrying his child, without caring that she had nowhere to go. He had disappeared as if she had never mattered, as if the children had never mattered, and now, after all these years, he was back. Liam watched her carefully. "Emily," he said gently, "you need to tell me what he's capable of." She released a sharp breath, her voice almost a whisper. "You don't understand. Jake isn't just some ex-boyfriend, he's dangerous, Ethan. He doesn't do anything without a reason. If he's back, it's because he wants something." She swallowed. "And that means we're in trouble." Liam's jaw clenched. He had expected her to be upset, but this was pure fear. He had never seen Ava like this before. She was strong, always standing her ground, always fighting back, but now she looked trapped. "What did he do to you?" Liam asked, his voice soft, steady. Ava shook her head, stepping back as if to create distance between herself and the memories. "It's not what he did to me," she whispered, her hands curling into fists. "It's what he's capable of." She turned to look at Ethan, her eyes holding something he had never seen before. "Jake doesn't just walk away from things, he destroys them." Liam exhaled slowly, his mind racing. If Jake was back for Emily, if he was back for the children, then this was just the beginning. He took her hands in his, squeezing them tightly. "We won't let him near you," he promised, "not you, not the kids." Ava bit her lip, her breathing still uneven. "You don't know him, Ethan," she whispered, "you don't know what he's capable of." Liam met her eyes, his expression unwavering. Then tell me," he said, "because whatever he's planning, we'll stop it." Ava looked at him for a long moment, her mind a battleground of memories, pain, and fear, and then finally she whispered, "You have no idea what you're getting into." The night was cold, the kind of biting cold that seeped into your bones, but Ava barely felt it. She stood motionless outside a small cafe on the outskirts of town, her heart pounding so hard it drowned out the sound of passing traffic. She didn't want to be here, didn't want to see him again, but she knew she had no choice. Jake Parker had forced his way back into her life, and if she didn't face him now, he would only keep pushing until he got what he wanted, her daughters. Just the thought of it made her clutch the edge of her coat as if trying to shield herself from the storm about to break. The cafe door opened and there he was, Jake. He hadn't changed much, still those calculating dark eyes, still that smug smile that used to make her heart flutter, but now only filled her with dread. His presence was suffocating, as if the very air recoiled from him. He walked towards her with the confidence of a man who had never faced consequences, a man who thought he still had power over her, but he didn't, not anymore. Well, he drawled, slipping his hands into the pockets of his expensive coat. Look who it is, Emily, what a pleasure to see you again. His eyes raked over her, assessing, mocking, then his smug smile deepened. I heard you were living in a mansion, guess you finally figured out how to trade up. Ava clenched her jaw, refusing to let his words get to her. She had expected this. Jake always knew exactly how to push people's buttons, how to twist the truth until it fit his narrative, but she wasn't that naive, desperate girl anymore. She held her head high, keeping her voice steady. Why are you here, Jake? He chuckled, shaking his head. Straight to the point, I always liked that about you. Then his expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he took a slow step closer. But I don't like being ignored. You've been hard to find, Emily, disappearing like a ghost, then boom, suddenly you're living with Liam Montgomery. He almost spat the name, his jaw clenching. Care to tell me how that happened? Ava crossed her arms, her nails digging into her sleeves. What happens in my life is none of your business, she said firmly. You lost the right to care the moment you walked away. Jake's smug smile vanished, his eyes turning cold, predatory. You're wrong, he said, tilting his head slightly. Because you have something that concerns me, two things actually. Ava's stomach clenched. She knew what he was talking about, but she refused to let fear control her. She had spent too many years being afraid of him, not anymore. You mean the daughters you never wanted, the children you abandoned without a second glance, she retorted, her voice sharp as glass. Jake's expression flickered, but he quickly regained his composure. Things change, he said smoothly. And now I think it's time I took responsibility. A bitter laugh escaped Ava's lips before she could stop it. Responsibility? You don't even know what that word means. She took a step closer, her eyes blazing with anger. You weren't man enough to be a father, and now you want to control them? Her voice trembled, but not with fear, with rage. Years of pain, of struggling, of raising Isabella and Chloe alone, it all came flooding back. You abandoned us, Jake, you made your choice, and you don't get to waltz back into their lives like nothing happened. Jake's nostrils flared, his fingers twitching at his sides. You think you get to decide that? His voice was lower now, more dangerous. You think Liam Montgomery is going to protect you forever? Ava's breath hitched, but she refused to back down. I don't need him to protect me. I've been protecting myself for years, I've been protecting them for years. She took another step, meeting his angry eyes with unwavering strength. But I won't let you hurt them. Jake exhaled sharply through his nose, running a hand through his hair as he gave a dry laugh. You really think you can stop me? He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice to a whisper. You've forgotten who I am, Emily. I don't lose. A voice cut through the tension. No, but you're about to. Jake barely had time to turn before Liam stepped between them, his posture rigid, his eyes blazing with a protective fire Ava had never seen before. His presence was a wall, an unspoken warning. I suggest you leave, Liam said, his voice low and controlled. Jake studied him for a moment, his smug smile returning, but this time it was strained. Well, look at this, he mused, the billionaire playing hero. Tell me, Ethan, what do you get out of this? What's she giving you? Liam didn't flinch. The only thing that matters, a chance to fix what you broke. For a split second, Jake's mask cracked, his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists, but he knew he couldn't win. He let out a long breath, stepping back. This isn't over, he warned, his voice laced with unspoken threat. Then, with a final glance at Emily, he turned and disappeared into the night. The moment he was gone, Ava felt her knees weaken. Liam steadied her before she could fall, his hands lightly gripping her shoulders. Are you all right? He asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, but her hands still trembled. He won't stop, she whispered. Liam's grip tightened. Neither will I. And for the first time in years, Ava believed him. The atmosphere in the Montgomery mansion was thick with tension, an invisible weight pressing down on the walls of the grand estate. Liam had always known his father was a ruthless man, pragmatic, calculating, and unwilling to let emotion cloud his judgment. Richard Montgomery had built his empire on discipline and control, on knowing when to cut ties with the weak and ally with the strong, and now, standing in his father's study, Liam knew he was being forced to make a choice. The storm had been brewing since the moment he brought Ava and her daughters into his home, but now, after the confrontation with Jake, it had finally erupted. Richard paced the room, his polished leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. His expression was unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. Finally, he turned his sharp eyes, locking onto Liam with unwavering precision. "I warned you, Ethan," he said, his voice measured, chillingly cold. "I told you this would happen. I told you she would bring trouble." He gestured towards the newspaper on his desk, its front page marred by the scandal of Liam Montgomery harboring a homeless woman and her children and the sudden reappearance of Jake Parker. "This is a disaster, and it's only going to get worse. Ava and her daughters have nothing to do with this," he said firmly. "Jake is the problem, not them." Richard scoffed, his lip curling in contempt. "Don't be naive," he said, shaking his head. "This whole situation is a mess, Ethan, a liability. Do you think the board won't react to this? Do you think the investors won't start questioning your judgment? You have a responsibility to this company, to this family." His voice sharpened, cutting. "And that responsibility doesn't include her." Liam exhaled slowly, trying to keep his composure. He had spent years proving himself to his father, fighting for his respect, to show that he was worthy of carrying the Montgomery legacy, but this wasn't about business, this was about right and wrong. He met his father's eyes, refusing to back down. "She needs help," he said simply, "and I'm not going to abandon her." Richard gave a harsh laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Help," he repeated, shaking his head. "Is that what you call it, Ethan? Wake up, she's using you. Do you think she hasn't done this before? Find a wealthy man to pity her, to take her in." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper. "You're a Montgomery, you don't throw everything away for a woman like that." Liam's blood boiled. He had expected resistance, but not this, not the sheer cruelty in his father's words, the way he spoke of Ava as if she were nothing more than a parasite clinging to the edge of their world. "You don't know her," he said, his voice cold, steady. "You don't know what she's been through, how hard she's fought to survive. She's stronger than anyone I've ever met, including you." Richard's expression darkened. "This isn't about strength," he snapped. "It's about survival, about making the right choices." His hands curled into fists. "And you're making the wrong one." Liam felt his heart pounding, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had spent his entire life chasing his father's approval, molding himself into the perfect son, the perfect businessman, but for the first time he realized that nothing he did would ever be enough. His father would always see the world in black and white, power and weakness, assets and liabilities, and Ava wasn't an asset in his eyes. Richard exhaled sharply, taking a step back. His voice was calm, decisive. "If you choose this woman, you are no longer my son." The words hit Liam like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He stared at his father, searching for something, regret, hesitation, a sign that this was just a threat, not a real ultimatum, but Richard's face was stone cold, unyielding. He meant it. This was a choice, Ava or the Montgomery name. Silence filled the room, heavy with unspoken words. Liam's hands clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with slow, measured breaths, then finally he spoke. "Then I guess I never was." Richard's face flickered, a brief moment of something unreadable in his eyes, but then it was gone, replaced by the cold detachment he had perfected over the years. "Then so be it," he said simply, then he turned, walking towards his desk, dismissing Liam without another word. Liam didn't wait, he turned on his heel and walked out, his heart pounding. The moment he stepped into the hallway, he exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. This was it, he had made his choice, and for the first time in his life, he didn't regret it. Ava was waiting for him outside the study, her arms wrapped around herself as if bracing for bad news. When she saw his face, she frowned. "What happened?" she asked softly. Liam met her eyes, his chest tightening. Everything had changed in that room, but as he looked at her, the woman who had endured more than anyone should have to, the mother who had fought to protect her daughters, the only person who had made him question everything he thought he knew. He knew he had made the right decision. He took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I chose you." Ava's breath hitched, and for a moment she just stared at him. Then slowly she nodded. She knew what it meant, and though the battle was far from over, for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was fighting alone. The Montgomery mansion felt colder that morning, not because of the weather, though the sky was overcast, heavy with the threat of rain, but because of the weight that pressed down on Ethan's chest. He hadn't slept, not really, his father's words still echoing in his head, sharp as a blade. "If you choose this woman, you are no longer my son," but that wasn't his biggest concern anymore. There was something else now, something far worse. James, the butler, who had practically raised Liam after his mother's death, entered the study with hesitant steps. His usually impassive face was creased with worry as he held out a small envelope. The moment Liam saw it, a wave of nausea washed over him. The expensive, unmarked paper, the same sense of foreboding tightening in his gut. Another letter. Liam took it with a steady hand, though inside he was anything but calm. He tore it open, his eyes scanning the words written in precise, deliberate strokes. You think you've won, but you don't even know what game you're playing. You think you're protecting her, but how will she feel when she knows the truth? You don't need to fear me, Ethan, you need to fear what happens when your secrets are exposed. I don't need violence to destroy you, I just need the truth. Liam took a sharp breath, his hand clenching around the paper until it crumpled in his fist. Damn it, he had expected Jake to try something, but this was worse than any threat of violence. Jake wasn't just trying to take Ava away, he was trying to destroy Ethan's entire world. He knew Ava would ask questions, what truth? What was Jake talking about? And for the first time since this whole thing started, Liam didn't know if he was ready to give her the answers. Ava sat in the living room, her mind restless as she heard the sharp sound of footsteps in the hallway. She knew it was Liam before she even looked up. His movements were too controlled, his jaw too tight. He was holding something back, and she had learned to recognize when Liam Montgomery was trying to keep his world from falling apart. Another letter, she asked before he had a chance to speak. Liam hesitated, but there was no point in denying it. He sighed and handed her the crumpled paper. She carefully unfolded it, her fingers tracing the lines as she read. Her brow furrowed, her hand tightening. When she finally looked up, there was confusion in her eyes, but also something that made Liam's stomach clench, suspicion. What does this mean? She asked, her voice steady, but he could hear the unspoken fear beneath it. Liam ran a hand through his hair, pacing for a moment before finally stopping in front of her. It's just Jake trying to manipulate you, he said, but the words sounded hollow because even he knew that Jake wasn't bluffing. Ava narrowed her eyes. That's not an answer. Liam let out a heavy sigh. He had spent years keeping this secret, believing it was the right thing to do, but now, standing before the woman he had fought so hard to protect, the weight of it was unbearable. There are things about my family I never told you, he admitted, things that if Jake gets his hands on, he could twist into something dangerous. Ava stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then she asked softly, Does this have anything to do with why you left me back then? The question cut deeper than he expected. Liam clenched his jaw. He had always justified his past mistakes as a consequence of circumstance, but Ava's voice held something more than anger, it held betrayal, and that was something he couldn't ignore anymore. He knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. She flinched at first, but didn't pull away. Emily, he said, his voice softer now. I never wanted to leave you, but my father, he made me believe I had no choice. Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing, letting him continue. When I found out you were pregnant, I wanted to be with you, I was ready to run, to fight for us, but then my father called me into his office and told me if I left with you, he would destroy everything. Liam swallowed, the memory still bitter after all these years. He threatened my mother's inheritance, my business prospects, everything I had worked for, and I was weak. I let him convince me that leaving was the only way to protect you. Ava's breath hitched. You thought leaving me was protecting me? Liam closed his eyes for a brief moment. No, he admitted. I know it wasn't, and I've regretted it every single day since. He tightened his grip on her hands, forcing her to look at him. But I have a choice now, and I choose you. I choose to fight for you, for the kids, and I won't let Jake or my father take this away from us again. Ava looked into his face, her walls still up, still unsure if she could allow herself to believe him, but there was something in his voice, in the unwavering way he held her hands, that made her pulse quicken. Maybe he did mean it this time. Then he whispered softly, I won't let him hurt you again. Ava felt her throat tighten, emotions flooding her all at once. For years she had carried the weight of his absence, the pain of being left alone to fend for herself, and now, for the first time she saw remorse, genuine remorse in his eyes, but remorse wasn't enough. Releasing a shaky breath, she pulled her hands away. Then prove it, she whispered, because if Jake is coming for us, I need to know you won't run this time. Liam stood up, his expression resolute. I won't, because the stakes were higher than ever now, and he was done running. The night was heavy with tension, the kind that made the air feel thick, colder. Ava sat alone in the dimly lit living room of the Montgomery mansion, her fingers unconsciously tracing the worn silver ring on her hand. She could hear the faint hum of the city beyond the mansion's gates, a constant reminder that the outside world still existed, a world filled with threats, uncertainties, and a past that refused to let her go. Isabella and Chloe were asleep in the next room, their soft breaths the only sound anchoring her to the present, but even with them safe behind closed doors, Ava couldn't shake the unease that weighed down her chest. Something was wrong. She had spent years honing her instincts, learning to recognize the signs of danger. Tonight, every fiber of her being screamed that something was very wrong. The Montgomery mansion was supposed to be impenetrable, surrounded by security cameras and guards stationed at every entrance, but as the long night wore on, Ava couldn't shake the creeping feeling that someone was watching her. She moved towards the window, carefully pulling back the curtains just enough to peer outside. The gardens below were bathed in moonlight, casting long shadows across the stone pathways, and then there was movement, a dark figure slipping through the trees, moving quickly, purposefully. Her blood ran cold. Jake. She barely had time to react before the door burst open with a force that sent her staggering back. He was there, taller, stronger than she remembered, his presence sucking the air from the room, his eyes dark with rage, locking onto her as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with slow, deliberate intent. "You think you can hide from me?" Jake's voice was low, venomous. "You really think running to him would keep you safe?" Ava's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to show fear. She squared her shoulders, taking a step back only to realize there was nowhere left to go. "You don't belong here, Jake," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Get out." Jake gave a dark chuckle, shaking his head. "Cute, he sneered. "You really think you have a say in what I do? You think just because you have a rich boyfriend that I don't have a say in my kids' lives?" "They were never yours," Ava retorted, a flare of anger igniting in her words. "You made your choice when you walked away, when you left me to fend for myself. You don't get to come back now and pretend to care." The words seemed to ignite something in him, his jaw tightening, and in a flash, he lunged for her, grabbing her wrist with a bruising grip. Ava gasped, trying to fight his hold, but he was stronger. "You don't get to decide that," he growled, pulling her closer, his hot breath on her face. "You think I'd let you take them away from me? You think I'd let you live this perfect little life with him?" His grip tightened painfully so. "I don't think so." A flicker of fear shot through Emily, but she refused to let it consume her. She had fought too hard to be afraid of him now, but before she could retort, the door burst open. Jake barely had time to turn before Liam was on him. The impact sent Jake staggering back, releasing Ava as he crashed into the wardrobe. Liam's rage was palpable, his usual calm demeanor shattered as he lunged at Jake, grabbing the lapels of his coat and slamming him against the wall. "You dare touch her?" Liam's voice was thick with fury, his fists clenching as Jake tried to fight back. "You think you can just walk into my house and lay a hand on her?" Jake gave a harsh chuckle, wiping blood from his split lip. "What's the matter, Montgomery?" he sneered. "Afraid she'll realize you're just as bad as me?" Liam didn't hesitate, his fist connecting with Jake's jaw, the force sending him crashing to the floor. But before Jake could recover, the sound of sirens filled the air. "Police?" Liam exhaled sharply, stepping back as two uniformed police officers stormed into the room, guns drawn. "Jake Parker," one of them barked. "You're under arrest for trespassing, assault, and violation of a restraining order." Jake wiped blood from his mouth, giving a bitter laugh. "This isn't over," he spat, glaring at Ava as the officers hauled him to his feet. "You think this ends with me in handcuffs? You're a fool if you think I'm the only danger in your life." Ava didn't flinch, meeting his eyes with unwavering resolve and whispering the words she had waited years to say. "I'm finally free." Jake's smug smile faltered for the first time, and then just like that he was gone, his threats fading into the distance. The silence that followed was deafening. Ava felt her knees buckle, but before she could fall, Liam was there, pulling her into his arms. He held her tight, his heartbeat thundering in her ear. "It's over," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his hands stroking her hair. "He can't hurt you anymore." Ava closed her eyes, sinking into the warmth of his embrace. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe it. She was safe, her daughters were safe, and Jake Parker was nothing more than a ghost of the past. Morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow over the Montgomery mansion. The tension that had clung to its walls had finally dissipated, leaving behind something Ava hadn't felt in years: peace. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she didn't wake up in fear, in uncertainty, no longer burdened by the constant weight of survival. Instead, she woke to the sound of laughter, her daughter's laughter. It echoed from the hallway, high-pitched and sweet, filling the once-cold mansion with something it had long been missing: life. Ava sat up slowly, running a hand through her hair as she let the moment sink in. It still felt surreal, being here, being safe, being free. The past few days had been a whirlwind: Jake's arrest, the relentless questioning from the police, the final letting go of the past, and through it all, Liam had been there, steady, unwavering, hers. She breathed out, glancing towards the bedroom door as it burst open, Isabella and Chloe barreling in first, their little feet pattering on the floor as they clambered onto the bed, giggling. "Mommy, guess what?" Chloe chirped, her eyes bright with excitement. "Liam made pancakes and he let us have extra syrup." Ava's heart swelled at their joy at how easily they had embraced this new life as if they had always belonged here. Maybe they had. Before she could respond, Liam appeared in the doorway, a playful grin tugging at the corner of his lips. He was carrying a tray with 3 plates, each piled high with golden pancakes. "Breakfast in bed," he announced, stepping inside. "I figured you could use a morning of being taken care of instead of doing the taking care." Ava raised an eyebrow. "You cooked?" she teased, noticing the faint smear of flour on his sleeve. Liam scoffed, carefully setting the tray down. "Don't sound so surprised. I happen to be an excellent chef." Isabella giggled. "He almost burned the first batch." "Traitor," Liam muttered, playfully nudging her before turning back to Emily, his expression softening, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. No words needed, just understanding. Ava felt the weight of everything between them, the pain, the loss, the years of separation that had almost broken them. But now it didn't feel like a wound. It felt like something healed, something whole. She reached out, placing her hand over his. "Thank you," she said, the meaning far outweighing the words she could express. Liam's fingers curled around hers, the grip warm, steady. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "You and the girls, you belong here." Ava's breath hitched. "I belong here?" How long had she dreamed of hearing those words? How long had she convinced herself that belonging was for other people, not for her? She glanced at her daughters, their faces smeared with syrup, their giggles filling the room, and she realized she didn't want to run anymore. She wanted this. She wanted him. Liam must have sensed her thoughts, because he reached into his pocket, pulling out something small, something familiar, a ring. Not the old silver band she had clung to for years, the one that symbolized a painful past, but a new one, a shining one. Her breath caught as he took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Emily," he whispered, his voice deep, steady. "I spent years thinking I had lost you forever, that I had ruined everything. But you came back into my life, and I'm not letting you go again." He breathed out slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Stay, not just for now, not just because it's safe, but because this is where you belong." Ava's vision blurred with unshed tears. "Ethan," he smiled, that small, knowing smile that had always made her melt. "Marry me." His voice was soft, intimate, just for her. "Not because of the past, but because I love you, and I love them." He glanced at Isabella and Chloe, the children watching them with wide eyes, their little hands clasped together in anticipation. "I want to be their father, I want to be your husband, I want us to be a family, a real family this time." Ava felt something inside her shatter, her last doubts, her fears, the part of her that had spent years believing she didn't deserve this love. She looked at her daughters, their innocent, hopeful faces, and then at Ethan, the man who had fought for her, who had chosen her, who had never really stopped loving her. And suddenly the answer was easy. She nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek as she whispered, "Yes." The relief on Liam's face was immediate. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling slightly as if he couldn't believe it was real. And then he pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Isabella and Chloe squealed, throwing themselves into the embrace, giggling, laughing, their family finally whole. For the first time in her life, Ava wasn't afraid of the future. For the first time, she had a fresh start. This story is a powerful reminder of love, forgiveness, and second chances. Have you ever reconnected with someone from your past and realized things weren't as you once thought? If you were Ethan, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire many. If you found this story meaningful, feel free to share it with friends and family to spread the message of compassion and love together. Thank you for following to the end. Please like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next touching stories. Every day, we will bring you a new, meaningful story just for you. Leave a comment about where you are watching this video from. We would love to know where our stories have touched hearts around the world. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for supporting the channel. Please like, share, and subscribe to get the latest updates. The stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared for the purpose of spreading humane values in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any errors, please overlook them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.